You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
Today we're talking about probably one of the most crazed, inflammatory, sounds like out of a William Faulkner novel cases that I have ever had. I don't know if it's a pleasure or a privilege, but it's certainly the interesting opportunity to talk about on this podcast, and that would be the Alex Murdaugh Murders. Do you recall how you heard about this case originally? Because I'm thinking back, and I can't remember when it came across our radar.
Oh, it's been quite a while. I certainly had read about it a few years ago. I don't want to move past your, what did you call it? Your privilege?
My privilege to talk about this case, because it really does feel like this is the sort of case that podcasters all over the world would look at and go, this is great. Tell me more. We can do a whole series on this.
For what it's worth, I don't know about anybody else, but I felt like washing my hands every time I watched an episode. The sleaze just oozes out of this family. I mean, eesh.
Yes.
But what a fascinating story. And as you said, this is so bizarre and has so many twists and turns. This almost begins to read like fiction.
Like I said, William Faulkner novel for sure. Southern decadence, a family falling apart at the seams. Faulkner would look at this and go, you know what? I like it.
Yeah, drugs, alcohol, murder.
Right up a fiction writer's alley. But we are talking, of course, about the very real case, or cases rather, that surround the Murdaugh family. We had mentioned on our True Crime Roundup that neither of us had the bandwidth at that time to really focus on this case and the verdict, which had just come down. So Bill and I decided that we were going to watch, or rather Bill decided that we were going to watch The Murdaugh Murders, a Southern Scandal on Netflix. And so he watched and then I watched, and now we're going to regale you with our varied and sundry opinions on this fascinating Netflix series.
So one thing we'll tell all of you, this series is completely worth checking out. Mm-hmm. Now, it's a little out of date in that it's a 3-episode arc, and the case was underway at the time they finished the 3rd episode. I actually think they might want to consider doing a 4th episode and maybe a 5th, because as we'll get into in this conversation, there's so much more to this story. I would give the series 2 thumbs up. And even my partner, Pamela, who does not favor true crime, enjoyed it immensely. And she knew a little bit about the case from reading the newspaper and that sort of thing. But she was blown away by how much sordid content there was and all of the twists and turns in this sad tale.
It really is very sad and very moving at times. I finished the 1st episode and I just felt so badly for these young people who had gone through this whole experience of living through this boat crash. But we'll get into that here in just a second. I do want to make a quick note here of something that I noticed, and that is the news media at large has been pronouncing the name of the perpetrator, now convicted, as Alex Murdaugh, and we've been doing that too. If you listen to the audio on the series, he pronounces his name Alec as opposed to Alex, and the last name Murdaugh with a soft C at the end instead of Murdaugh. I would have to assume that he is the correct arbiter of how to say his name, rather than the news media that's been pronouncing it Alex Murdaugh. So just in the interest of continuity, I'm going to say his name the way that he has pronounced it. And if I'm wrong, then Sorry about that. Everybody will just kind of have to deal with it for this episode.
What's wrong with that?
But it really did surprise me when I was listening to all of this. And I was going, am I saying his name wrong? And I heard him pronounce his own name. And I was like, I guess I am.
Yeah, it almost sounds like Alec, and Murdaugh almost sounds like it's got a C or a CK at the end.
Yeah.
Which it does not. And of course, we hear a variety of people over the course of the 3 episodes talk about the families, and most of them are pronouncing it, most of the local folks are pronouncing it in a way that's closer to the way he says it.
Murdaugh with the C at the end. Yeah. And of course, I got schooled when what I long thought was the pronunciation of Beaufort. I thought it was Beaufort, Beaufort. I thought that was Beaufort. But no, it's Beaufort. And so I got schooled on that in particular. Interesting bits of pronunciation there.
And so this references the Low Country and this long-standing legal family who essentially are a dynasty for over 110 years.
Yeah, there was one quote that I wrote down almost immediately, and it came up within the first 5-10 minutes. And it was, for over 100 years, the Murdaugh family was the law in Hampton County.
As we get into the series, you begin to realize they've actually probably been getting away with murder. And that is an expression that you and I both use occasionally, but we actually mean this in exactly those terms. It actually appears that the Murdaugh family have been getting away with murder for any number of years. And the series begins to just peel back layers of a very foul onion as the story unfolds.
It establishes fairly early on that if you look at the Murdaugh family, there are 5 bodies associated with that family within a 6-year stretch. When the case first came onto my radar, I think it was at the very beginning when it came on a lot of people's radar with this news story that a South Carolina attorney had been found shot on the side of the road with an injury to his head. And that is how I first heard about the family. Longer that story went on, it started unwinding. And I really appreciated this series because it put everything in context. I got the opening event, which is the boat crash, and we'll get into that in just a second. And then it gave me, okay, here's what we found out since the boat crash, this and then this. So this actually helped me watching the series, put in context for me, here are the major events that we're looking at in relation to this family.
So let's talk about the boat crash, February 23rd, 2019.
So on February 23rd, 2019, Paul Murdaugh, who is the younger sibling in the Murdaugh family, went out to an oyster roast, which is a Low Country tradition, with several young friends of his. Anthony Cook, his girlfriend, Mallory Beach, Paul Murdaugh's girlfriend, Morgan Dowdy. And then also with them were Connor Cook, Anthony Cook's cousin, and Miley Altman, who was Morgan and Mallory's best friend. So we've got a nice little tight friend group here. And they went out on that particular evening to an oyster roast. And they decided to, rather than drive, they were going to take Paul's boat.
One of the things that's come out in the reporting, they talk about it in the series and then in additional articles I read, was they were actually trying to avoid DUI checkpoints. It sounds like Paul, the son, was a serious alcoholic and drank to excess, as his friends often did, very frequently, and that he knew they were going to get hammered that evening, as they did many weekend nights, and they were trying to avoid the police because he had been involved in a number of serious automobile accidents involving alcohol. But then I understood, oh yeah, there's not going to be any patrolling on these inland waterways. I don't think you're going to have the Coast Guard or someone like that out checking for DUIs for boaters. And this allowed him to drink to a tremendous point of inebriation.
I was interested in the fact that one of the things that's established quite early, and this is from Morgan, Paul's girlfriend, I guess ex-girlfriend now, she established that not only was drinking just a regular thing for all of them, but that the parents, or at least the Murdaugh parents, were okay with it. That you would actually see video of them drinking in the presence of the parents, or the parents even slamming back a couple with them as well. My parents would not have been cool with me drinking. At this point, they were all underage.
And Paul purchases $50 worth of alcohol using his mother's credit card and his older brother Buster's ID. So he's using a fake ID and his mother's credit card. And she obviously would have seen the bills at a later point. They're more than just facilitating his alcoholic behavior.
And they made a point of stating, several people did, how much the alcohol actually changed Paul when he drank. They actually said that when he drank, they called him Timmy because the alcohol changed him, and for the worst. So there's Paul when he's sober, who apparently was very nice and polite and sweet and kind to his girlfriend. And then there's Timmy when he drinks. Timmy is apparently aggressive and abusive. Morgan talks about being slapped by him. It sounds almost like an alter ego. So you've got not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but Paul and Timmy. And it sounds like on the evening in question, Timmy was pretty firmly at the wheel.
One of the things that really saddened me about this episode was that they managed to collect a fair amount of footage from various sources that showed the evening unfolding at different times. There were some reenactments mixed in as well. At one point, they stop and actually go to a bar and drink even more. And you see the 6 young people stretched out along this pier, making their way back towards the boat, it would appear. And I kept thinking, and of course we have the benefit of knowing that something terrible will happen shortly after the video is shot. But I kept thinking how sad it was that these young people who knew that Paul was getting more and more intoxicated, and he refused to let anyone else drive the boat. He kept saying, no one else can drive the boat except for me. And of course, the truth is any one of them could have taken the wheel and probably done a better job. It saddened me that some of those young people didn't tell him, that's it, I'm not getting back on the boat if you're going to be this drunk and attempting to navigate with 6 people on board. And lives might have been saved, actually. And it's one of those things where obviously we have the benefit of some foreboding of what's about to happen.
Of course, after the boat crash, the senior member of the Murdaugh family, the grandfather, shows up at the hospital along with Alec, and they're very quick to try to pin the blame for the accident on Connor, who had not been driving, instead of on Paul. I remember hearing that and immediately going, my gosh, what a sleazeball. How of this?
There was a pattern for years where the boys got in trouble. Alcohol and speeding cars and trucks often were part of the mix. The first thing you did when you crashed your car, or in this case, crashed your boat, was call daddy or granddaddy to come get you out of this mess. And they had covered up any number of earlier incidents, even to the point where law enforcement wasn't called. Tow trucks were called in, vehicles were righted, and everything just gets papered over.
Yeah. So the evening of the oyster roast, they do decide that they're going to head back on the boat, and they're heading down Archer's Creek. And there was apparently quite the argument forming about who should have been driving. Clearly, it should not have been Paul, Timmy, whoever happened to have been at the wheel at that point. Ultimately, the boat hit a pylon on one of the bridges on Archer's Creek. And they showed a recreation of where everybody had been sitting. And it looks like what happened is that when the boat hit the bridge, Anthony and Mallory were both thrown out of the... Once Mallory was found, and it wasn't until 7 days later that she was found, they had mentioned that she had trauma to the head and then she had drowned. So it sounds like she probably hit the piling of the bridge or hit her head on the way down and then drowned in the water after that. There were injuries from some of the others in the boat. When they're interviewing Connor, you can actually see the scar that he got from the accident that's on his jaw. And then Morgan had some injuries to her hand. Her hand got crushed against the side of the boat. It's a real tragedy. And you can tell that even now, years from it, it's still very hard for these young people to talk about, and for their parents as well. They got the parents on camera, and you can just see how incredibly traumatic and difficult this still is for those parents.
The producers of the show actually managed to come up with video from the immediate aftermath of the crash showing how incredibly deferential South Carolina Law Enforcement Division personnel and others were to the Murdaugh family, and how angry some of the young people who had survived the crash were clearly still pretty drunk, but there was a lot of anger directed at Paul for flying through this very narrow gap under a bridge and crashing into the piling. It was very clear who was operating the boat. But then, of course, the cover-up starts almost immediately.
And as the kids are being taken to the hospital, you do have that secure, and they really got some interesting security footage and law enforcement footage. I was surprised, actually, how much the producers and directors were able to get for this. You get this footage that you can see of the Murdaugh family, daddy and granddaddy, sweeping in and trying to do cleanup and cover up almost immediately. They even said that Alex Murdaugh insisted that he was everyone's attorney. He was speaking for all of the kids. None of them were going to talk without him in the room. And you could tell just as much that Morgan, for example, was like, he does not speak for me. I'll speak when he's not in the room. It's a little frightening, the speed with which they just came immediately in and were like, okay, what needs to be done? You can tell this wasn't the first time they were covering up.
No, and the reporting from the individuals when they had a chance to step back. Several years have gone by since the boat crash in 2019, but they made it very clear that Murdaugh was whispering in people's ear, don't say anything, and then immediately began building a story, which is completely false, that Connor Cook was operating the boat at the time of the crash. A complete fabrication, and everything is designed to deflect blame, which at that point was being attached to Paul, who was completely drunk. They had amazing footage of him struggling while intoxicated beyond all measure. I was really amazed that they were able to use this footage in the way that they did, because I don't know how the clearances worked and FOIA requests were filed, but they actually were able to tell you the story and had visuals to go with almost all of it. And there is some reenactment, as I mentioned, but most of it is actually found footage from the hospital, from law enforcement, and other sources.
Yeah, one of the things when I was commenting to a friend about this, who had also watched the series, we were talking about how much of the footage from the oyster roast and beforehand was from people's social media feeds, Instagram, Snapchat. It's still, I sound like an official old person when I say this, fair warning. It's still surprising to me, I think, on a lot of levels, how much of people's lives they're documenting moment to moment on Instagram and Snapchat and various other social media feeds. I'm guilty of posting to Facebook multiple times a day. I'll admit it. I totally am. But not to the extent that you see with some of the young people that I teach and other people. I was just surprised how much footage there actually was. But it is because we're so used, I think, to documenting every aspect of our lives.
Including moments that I think are incredibly unflattering.
Yeah.
I was very surprised by how often drunken footage of these young kids shows up. They are completely hammered and behaving in ways that their parents probably wouldn't be terribly proud of. Yet there it is for the whole world to see.
And I have to remind my students every once in a while, anything that you don't want an employer or a college or someone who's considering you for an internship to see, you can't post on the internet. They will find this stuff.
In researching today's story, I actually found a new news story that stated that two guys from the UK who met Paul Murdaugh in the Bahamas in 2017, not knowing about the boat accident, because of course they live in another country, and not having seen the Murdaugh Murders, A Southern Scandal television series yet on Netflix, They recently posted a drunken video from 2017 where Paul is in rare form, completely drunk. He actually wrote to them and asked them to take the footage down, which they did do. Paul stated he was no longer dating Morgan and that he was not allowed to speak with her. I think the implication was legally. He asked his friends from the UK to please take the footage down, and they did comply. But they recently did some interviews where they talked about the fact that this was yet another example of social media footage showing Paul Murdaugh completely incapacitated.
Wow.
Drunk beyond drunk.
Some of the footage that I found particularly interesting was the parents speaking up about what had happened. And one of the quotes that I wrote down that I thought was particularly interesting came from Connor Cook's dad. And he said, Connor came to me in tears and asked me, Daddy, are they going to try to kill me? When it turned out that the Murdaughs could not pin Connor as being the person who was driving the boat that night. That's chilling right there, to have that kind of sway over people that you immediately strike fear into them. And the question of, are they going to kill me?
Of course, knowing what we know now, it doesn't seem so far-fetched, does it?
No, not at all. And another quote that I wrote down that I found was very impactful is from Mallory Beach's mother, who said, the Murdaughs didn't want her to be found because if there is no body, there is no crime.
It sounds like they were really hoping during that week before her body was found that she would never be recovered and that the body would have been washed out to sea.
Yeah. Ultimately, Mallory's body was recovered. It took 7 days, but she was ultimately able to be given a burial. And her father and all of these parents were just so visibly moved that I started getting teared up as well. Her father had said at the time of the shooting of the miniseries, and now I'm hoping he feels fulfilled on this part, he said, we want to see earthly justice handed out. None of us is above the law. And I'm hoping that they're looking at some of this with the outcome of the Murdaugh trial. And I hope that they feel that with the incarceration of Alex Murdaugh, that some measure of justice has been handed out on behalf of Mallory Beach.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. So this probably brings us to the murder of Maggie, age 52, and Paul Murdaugh, age 22, in 2021.
For all that this is what Alex Murdaugh just went to jail for, there is actually the least amount of coverage on this particular double murder in the series. We didn't get as much about that as I would have hoped. And for somebody who did not follow the case as minutely as probably I should have, I found that I did have to do some additional research on the murder of Maggie and Paul. They were, both of them, shot multiple times with different types of guns, which I found interesting. Maggie was found with multiple shots in her chest and back from an AR-15 rifle, while Paul was found shot in the chest and once in the throat with a shotgun.
And these were called in by Alex Murdaugh, the father, who claimed to have been visiting with his ailing parents some miles away. Although late in the trial, a video was introduced into evidence which Paul, the son, had shot, which is actually him interacting with one of their hunting dogs. You can clearly hear his father's voice in the background, engaging with Paul in some conversation. Nothing particularly profound about the conversation, but it completely broke down the claimed alibi that Alex stated he was visiting with his parents at their home, and he couldn't have been visiting with his parents at that point because the cell phone video, which was time and date stamped, clearly placed the father at or close to the dog kennel where his son was interacting with the hunting dog.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. I'm interested in your opinion on the 911 call because it's very evocative. Tell you what, before I say what it is that I thought, I'm curious what you think. What did you think about the 911 call?
My initial reaction hearing the 911 call some weeks back was that it sounded fake and implausible, and just his answers to the questions were so specific. He was introducing topics into a conversation with a 911 dispatcher that seemed completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
He mentions, I turned them over to see if they were breathing, and it felt like he was trying to head off questions that were going to come up later. As we learned as the trial unfolded, this guy is highly manipulative and has been a practicing attorney for decades. And he is trying to establish into evidence aspects of the scenario that will develop for the investigators going through the evidence they see before them. He was already, even from the point of the 911 call, adding in all this extraneous detail, which didn't ring true for me. And I went back and listened to the calls again this afternoon before we recorded. The whole thing seems very contrived.
It definitely sounds contrived to me as well. And I would say, too, very over the top. Granted, and again, I had this conversation with a friend of mine who had also watched this. Now, granted, I don't think any of us can really know how we would respond in a major emergency.
Agreed.
And we were both talking about times, for example, that both of us had acted in ways that we did not feel were necessarily appropriate to the situation. That happens, and I freely acknowledge that. I felt like his response, the up octave, incredibly high pitched, frantic, hysterical screaming, it sounded contrived. It sounded like somebody who was trying for what's the right level of despairing and distraught that I should sound if I've just found my wife and son murdered. That's what it felt like. That felt more contrived than anything else. And this is from someone who spent a lot of her formative years in the theater around very good actors.
I was just thinking the same thing. It felt theatrical. It felt like acting.
And it felt like this sort of act. It felt like someone had told him, act like you would think someone would act if you've just found someone dead. And it just didn't, it wasn't ringing true to me. And then everything else that you mentioned, too, about the odd interjections and the 911 call and the extraneous, unnecessary information that definitely sounded like, I know you're going to ask me this later, so let me put it in here now. It definitely sounded contrived to me.
I also thought it was very odd. It came out at trial that Alex Murdaugh was wearing a clean white shirt and clean cargo pants and shoes, and even the investigators noticed his shoes were remarkably clean because they said with these extensive gunshot wounds and his son, Paul, had been shot in the head and there was a great deal of bleeding, plus the ground was wet. They said everyone that was there, the investigators, first responders, was finding that their feet were very wet from mud and water and blood, of which there was a tremendous amount. Yet somehow the father claiming to the 911 dispatcher, oh, I turned them over to see if they were breathing. He doesn't have a spot of blood on him. And if you had knelt down to see if somebody was alive or dead, and they're surrounded by mud and water and blood, you get some of it on you, and yet he had nothing. And the investigators even noticed his shoes were spotless. And they were standing in the same mess, and they said it was really bad.
And okay, so maybe he did kneel down, turn them over, got all muddy. Maybe he decided that before investigators got there, he was going to go back inside and he was going to change into something nice and presentable.
But who does
why not?
that?
A, who would do that? And B, wouldn't you just admit it? Oh, sorry, guys. I had blood all over me. I decided to wear something clean. My bad. Shouldn't have done it. I mean, the whole idea that, oh, yeah, I turned them over, but somehow I magically have beautifully clean clothes and shoes. I don't buy it.
I don't think so.
Minute.
Not for a
minute.
minute.
Not for a minute.
Interesting note as well that once the trial was complete, and of course he was found guilty for both murders and has been sentenced now to lengthy prison stays, jurors were free to be interviewed by the media, and at least 3 jurors have chosen to speak to interviewers. And a number of them said they thought that Murdaugh's decision to take the stand in his own defense, apparently over the objections of his defense attorneys, who did not think it was a smart idea. A number of the jurors said they were absolutely convinced by his performance on the stand that he was lying, and they felt that he was attempting to be highly manipulative to turn on the tears when he thought it was appropriate and turn them off. They thought it was very theatrical, not believable. And it's interesting, I went back and was reading the transcripts from the 911 dispatcher, and even she said she thought he was trying to turn on the tears at different times, over the phone even. Your idea of the actors rehearsing for a role, it almost feels like that's exactly what he was doing throughout this entire thing.
When you hear the 911 call from him later, when he's by the side of the road and he says he's been shot, he doesn't sound like someone who's just been shot. Now, granted, I have never been, and I hope to goodness I never will be. So I don't really know what you would sound like if you've been shot, but you certainly don't sound the way that he did. He was casual about it. And then when the dispatcher is like, where have you been shot? He goes, oh, in the head, but I'm fine. No, sir, you're not. You've been shot in the head, but you don't sound like it. You sound like you're making up a story.
Right.
That you have been shot in the head. It sounds like he has this idea in his head. I have to sound like I've been found my family murdered, shot in the head, whatever. And he just can't pull it off convincingly. He sounds like a bad actor. It turns out that he is.
One might think that based on this performance.
So after the Mallory Beach boat crash and then Paul and Maggie were murdered, the series takes an interesting and rather unexpected turn. And that is where they bring in 2 previous murders, as in prior to the boat crash, that they think might very well be connected to the Murdaughs. And so the first thing that was brought up was the 2015 murder of Stephen Smith, who it turns out was a classmate of Miley, Connor, Mallory, and Morgan's in school. And again, that kind of doesn't surprise me. They're from a small area. But he is also someone who had a connection to Buster Murdaugh. Now, Buster is the older sibling, the older son. And they hinted at the relationship in the series without fully going into what it may or may not have been. What was your impression of the relationship between Buster and Stephen Smith, Phil?
Stephen Smith, who was 19 at the time of his death and a nursing student, was openly gay. They didn't hammer the point into the ground, but it sure sounded like Buster and Stephen may have been an item. Given how obsessed with their image and how powerful and well-connected this family was, I'm not sure that a gay relationship between Buster and Stephen, I'm not sure how well that would have gone over. They were also classmates in school, and the way Stephen Smith was found, having likely been struck in the head and left in the middle of the road, not far from the estate where the Murdaugh family did their hunting, the whole thing strikes me as exceptionally odd. Now, they hit you with this late in the 3rd episode, if I'm not mistaken.
They did mention that he was found in the middle of the road, and the investigator who went back over it said, if you're hit by a car, you don't appear the way that Stephen Smith appeared on the road if you're hit by a car. If you're hit by a car, your shoes do not stay on your feet. Your cell phone does not remain in your pocket unbroken. You don't land directly in the middle of the roadway. If you're hit by a car, you have injuries consistent with being hit by a car. Stephen Smith had trauma, but he was lying intact in the middle of the road as if someone had dumped him there. I'm wondering if they placed him in the middle of the road in the hopes that he would get hit by a car that was passing. I'm wondering if that's some of what it was. But either way, he was deceased in the middle of the road, but in a manner inconsistent with that of someone who had been hit by a car.
The investigators who worked the crime scene also said There were no skid marks, broken glass, nothing from the car, because if I've seen a person hit by a car.
Yeah.
Not only does it do tremendous damage, obviously, to the human body when a vehicle hits a person, it also does a tremendous amount of damage to the car. The car would usually be dented or broken. There would be blood spatter. There might be broken glass. Headlights or other plastic parts on the front of the car would often be shattered. There'd be some evidence that a motor vehicle was there, and there's none of that. When they showed a recreation of what they think Stephen Smith's body looked like, he's just lying in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
As if, as you said, placed there, which is probably a much more likely outcome than him being struck by a car.
Yeah.
And his vehicle is found out of gas 3 miles away. Even his mother, who's been trying for years to have her son's case looked into with very little success until recently, she had said that he was a skittish kid and that he wouldn't have walked down the middle of this country road. He would have at least been over by the edge of the road because he would have been afraid to walk down the middle of the road for fear that he would be hit by a car. She said the whole situation seemed implausible at the time, and initial medical reports indicated that the medical examiner thought he might have actually been shot in the head, which is where his head injury had come from. And then later, that seemed to be just completely put aside. The experts feel that there's no way he was struck by a car.
Yeah, that seems pretty evident. So then they moved from the 2015 Stephen Smith murder to one more death in relation to the Murdaughs, and that is the 2018 death of, I think housekeeper is probably the right word. Housekeeper. She was referred to as a maid at one time or another. I feel like housekeeper is probably right. And that is the housekeeper Gloria Satterfield. Gloria Satterfield allegedly tripped over the family dogs out on the porch and fell backward down the steps. She hit her head, and apparently she died of that set of injuries. I was writing down some of the injuries that were a result of that, and she had subdural hematomas, which is bleeding under the skin, but also rib fractures, which I guess I can see happening if you fell down the steps. But the 911 call for that one sounded weird too.
It did. And of course, once again, Alec and his wife Maggie, still alive at this point, are the only people there at the estate besides Gloria Satterfield. They call it in as a slip and fall, as if she fell down the stairs, claiming she tripped over the dogs. And once again, the medical examiner says that this does not look like natural causes to them. It's not until this murder investigation gets going regarding Alex now being found guilty of killing Maggie and Paul that people begin to steer back towards Gloria Satterfield's death and asking what exactly happened there too.
Yeah.
At this point, you begin to realize this family, particularly Alec, is surrounded by death.
Yeah.
People are dying all over the place.
So you've got the 2015 murder of Stephen Smith, probable murder, I guess we should say. It hasn't been proved. The 2018 death of Gloria Satterfield, the 2019 boat crash in which Mallory Beach was killed, and then the 2021 murders of Paul Murdaugh and Maggie Murdaugh. And then 3 months later, after that in 2021, comes the event that brought this, I think, all forward into the public eye, which is prominent South Carolina lawyer Alex Murdaugh found shot in the head on the side of the road. And that's when everybody was suddenly like, what is going on with this family? And that's when I remember it coming onto my radar. Depth of the depravity here, though, really knows no bounds.
It appears now that Alex Murdaugh wasn't actually attempting to commit suicide by having this man shoot him, but actually may have been setting up that man as the fall guy for the murder of Maggie and Paul, because apparently while this guy was supposed to be shooting him, he suddenly begins defending himself. And it now appears that Alex Murdaugh may be actually attempting to position this man as the killer of his wife and son. And at the very end of the doc, it comes out that, steering back to the Gloria Satterfield mysterious death, is that Alex Murdaugh has stolen $4.3 million of insurance money from her family in a death settlement.
Oh, jeez.
Alec had jacked up his commercial insurance to result in significant payouts for something like this. He purported to represent her family in seeking a death settlement from his own insurance company to the tune of $4.3 million, which Ms. Satterfield's sons never saw the money. Murdaugh, and now it's come out that he has actually defrauded any number of people for many millions of dollars over the years. I just read that he's now facing 100 additional charges.
That's crazy. I was reading that too. I was like, this is nuts.
In addition, of course, to appealing his murder conviction.
One of the quotes that I wrote down that I think really perfectly encapsulates this case came from one of the lawyers for Miss Satterfield's family. And they said, every dead body has a story that suits Alex's needs.
Isn't that amazing?
And it is so entirely true. Every dead body has a story that suits Alex's needs.
Yet it would appear, from what we've heard from the jurors in this most recent double homicide case, no one's buying his bullshit.
Yeah. It does appear that Alex Murdaugh is going to be appealing his sentence, which is his right. I'm going to be very interested to see if Buster Murdaugh is going to have any charges leveled at him, particularly with relation to the Stephen Smith case. I think that will be interesting. And I did read that Gloria Satterfield's family has asked for Gloria Satterfield to be exhumed so that they can get a closer look at her injuries and see if there are additional charges that may need to be brought in her case.
And apparently at Alex Murdaugh's sentencing, a person in the courthouse gallery called out Buster's next as he was led away.
I am very interested to see how this is going to continue to play out. And I'm curious if there are any other charges and mysterious deaths that may come out as people continue to investigate the Murdaugh family. I'm curious, for example, if Granddad has any skeletons in his closet, literal or figurative.
I wouldn't be surprised.
That's going to do it for our coverage. The Netflix series is called The Murdaugh Murders, A Southern Scandal, and we cannot recommend it enough. It is an excellent viewing and relatively short. Like, it only took me, 3 hours to watch it, I think. I love that now 3 hours is relatively short. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. If you like what we're doing, please make sure that you give us a 5-star rating or review on all of your podcast channels. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.